The warship cut through red clouds like a falling star, and Kate Morrison watched from her command chair as the old ash forest planet came into view below them, and humanity had left this world 300 years ago when the first wave of settlers failed, and now the Confederation was dying, and enemies were closing in from every direction, and Kate needed help from someone who had disappeared 40 years earlier. The tactical officer looked up from his screen, and his face showed confusion, and he said the sensors were picking up only one human-shaped life form and one other thing that the computer could not identify, and it seemed reptilian, but the size readings made no sense. Kate leaned forward and studied the data on her screen, and the coordinates matched what the secret message had told them, and this was where Lyra Ashwood was supposed to be. And Lyra was the elven warrior who had fought beside humans during the Great Battle 4 decades ago, and then she had vanished and taken important secrets with Hertha. Ship landed in a clearing, and its engines blew leaves and dust everywhere, and Kate walked down the ramp alone, because the message had been very clear about that, and the forest was completely silent. And it felt wrong, like the whole planet was holding its breath, and then she saw movement between the ancient trees. A figure stepped out into the clearing in silver. Hair flowed like water made of moonlight, and her armor looked like it had grown from living metal, and her eyes burned with sadness that came from living for centuries. And this was Lyra Ashwood, and she looked exactly as the old records described her. Then a mocking voice came from the shadows, and it said, "Look who is here." And 3 people appeared from the tree line, and they were mercenaries based on their mixed armor and weapons, and the leader was a woman with scars on her face and metal implants running up her neck, and she smiled in a cruel way, the scarred woman said. The famous humans were crawling back to beg the elf for help, and her voice dripped with contempt. And before Kate could answer, something huge moved in the trees above them, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the mercenaries stopped smiling. A shadow fell across the clearing, and then they all saw it, and scales like black mirrors covered its body, and eyes like melted gold stared down at them, and wings blocked out the sky completely, and the dragon landed beside Lyra, and the ground shook under its weight, and Kate understood why the computer could not classify what it had detected. Mercenary leader dropped her weapon, and her hands were shaking now, and she threw something else on the ground instead, and it was a broken spear, and the shaft had been snapped in half, and dark blood still stained the metal, and Kate recognized the markings immediately, and her chest went tight, because this was Commander Hayes' weapon, and Hayes was the man she had sent ahead to make contact. The scarred woman said Hayes had thought he could walk into Shadowfan territory, making demands, and her voice was harsh and angry, and she said Lord Vex had sent the broken spear as his answer, and she said the elf witch and her pet dragon were alone now, and nobody was coming to help either of them, and she backed away while talking and said they should stay out of the deep forest and stay away from Shadowfan, or end up like Hayes's. The mercenaries ran in their footsteps, faded into the forest, and then Lyra finally spoke, and her voice carried weight like mountains, and she said, Kate should not have come, and this war was older than humanity had been flying through space, and it was darker than humans could imagine. The dragon lowered its massive head and looked at Kate with eyes that showed frightening intelligence, and when it breathed out, frost formed in the air between. Then Kate kept her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding, and she said she had been told Lyra knew where it was, and she meant the Worldbreaker archive, and the weapon that could end this war. Lyra face showed nothing, but Kate saw something painful flash in those ancient eyes, and Lyra looked at the broken spear on the ground and said some weapons should stay buried, and she said Kate probably already knew that, or she would not have come alone, and she said Hayes had been a good man and did not deserve what Vex did to him. Kate said then, help me make his death mean something. Elf and her dragon looked at each other in a way that spoke of countless years together and bonds that went beyond what different species normally shared, and finally Lyra nodded slowly and said very well, but Kate needed to know something important. And the path to the archive went through Shadowfan and through Vex domain and through nightmares that humans had never faced before, and if they survived all that, the choice waiting at the end would be worse than anything that came before it. Kate picked up the broken spear from Hayes and put it in her belt, and said she had not come this far just to turn back. Nalira said no, she supposed Kate had not, and the elf turned toward the dark forest, and her dragon followed like a living storm. And Lyra said, "Come then," and she would show Kate what humanity had run away from all those centuries ago, and she would show Kate what had been waiting in the darkness all this time, patient and hungry for humans to return. As they walked into the shadows under the ancient trees, Kate felt like the forest itself was watching them and judging them and remembering everything, and somewhere deep in those woods something vast and terrible had just become aware that they were there. The war was about to begin for real, and this time there would be no running away and no going back. Kate followed Lyra and the dragon deeper into the forest, and the trees grew closer together, and the light from above grew dimmer, and the air smelled like decay and old magic, and she kept one hand on her plasma rifle and the other on haze. Broken spear Lyra moved through the twisted landscape like she had been born there, and the dragon stayed close, and its scales reflected colors that seemed wrong somehow. And Kate had to focus on not looking directly at them for too long after an hour of walking. Lyra stopped and turned back to Kate and said they needed to be clear about something, and Kate said, "What?" And Lyra said the archive was not just a weapon, and it was more like a curse, and everyone who had ever used it had paid a terrible price. Kate asked what kind of price. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, and the dragon made a low rumbling sound like distant thunder, and finally Lyra said that was something Kate would have to discover for herself, and if Lyra told her now, Kate might turn back, and her people needed her to keep going. Kate did not like that answer, but she understood it, and sometimes you had to walk into danger without knowing everything, and sometimes that was the only way to save the people you cared about. They kept walking, and the forest grew stranger with every step, and Kate saw trees that seemed to move when she was not looking directly at them, and she heard sounds that did not match any animal she knew, and once she thought she saw faces in the bark of the trees, watching them pass. Lyra said this place was alive in ways that normal forests were not, and it remembered everything that happened here, and it judged those who entered and decided if they were worthy or not, and many people had walked into these woods and never come back out. Kate asked what happened to them. Lyra said they became part of the forest, and part of the soil, and part of the memory, and the forest was always hungry for more. The dragon suddenly stopped and turned its head and looked back the way they had come, and frost came from its mouth, and Lyra put her hand on the sword at her side and told Kate to stay close. Something was following them through the trees, and Kate could not see it clearly, but she could feel it watching and waiting, and the air grew colder, and the shadows grew longer, even though the sun had not moved. Lyra said Vex knew they were here now, and he was sending scouts to watch them and report back, and soon he would know exactly where they were going and what they planned to do. Kate asked if that was a problem. Ira smiled, but there was no humor in it, and she said everything about this journey was a problem, and they were walking into a trap that had been set centuries ago, and the only question was whether they were strong enough and smart enough to spring the trap without getting caught in it themselves. They walked for 3 more hours, and the forest grew darker, and the trees grew twisted, and Kate saw bones on the ground, and old armor that had rusted away, and she realized these were the remains of the first human settlers who had tried to make peace with this world. Lyra said the forest had tested them and found them wanting, and it had consumed them and added their strength to its own, and that was why humanity had fled and never returned, until Kate looked at the bones and thought about Hayes and about all the people back home, waiting for her to return with hope, and she thought about the broken spear at her belt, and she knew she could not turn back no matter what horrors waited. Ahead night fell, and the forest became even more dangerous, and things moved in the darkness that Kate could not see clearly, and Lyra said they would camp here and continue in the morning. Dragon breathed a circle of frost around them. Lyra said nothing would cross that line while they slept, and Kate trusted her and tried to rest. But sleep came slowly in the darkness. Kate heard Lyra whisper to her dragon, and the dragon whispered back in a language that sounded like wind through ice, and Kate did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning, and they were afraid. And they were determined, and they knew the cost of what they were doing. Kate closed her eyes and thought about home, and about the war, and about Hayes, and about the choice she had made to come here, and she knew 3 days deeper into the forest, Kate began to understand why her ancestors had run from this world and the trees. Here did not just grow, they seemed to want things, and roots moved under her feet like sleeping snakes, and the bark leaked something. That dissolved metal when it touched her equipment, and twice her suit alarms went off, warning about poison in the air in both times. The dragon breathed out its crystal mist that made the poison disappear before it could reach Kate. Lyra, said humans, had called this land sanctuary when they first arrived centuries ago, and they did not understand that sanctuary meant something different here. And this world offered protection only to those it thought deserved it, and everyone else became food. For the deep soil, Kate ducked under a branch that reached for her on purpose and asked about Vex and how he survived in a place like this. Lyra said. Vex did not survive, he thrived, and he had been elven like her before the corruption took him. And now he was something else, and something that fed on the forest hunger and shaped it to his will. They came to a clearing where the ground was covered in bones, and Kate saw they were human bones, and the armor had rotted away, but she could still see the markings, and these were first expansion soldiers and the original colonists who stayed. Behind Lyra said Hayes was not the first human. Vex had killed, and when humanity abandoned this world, some people stayed, and they thought they could reason with Vex and trade with him, and they were all wrong. The dragon made a sound deep in his chest, like thunder rolling, and Lyra's hand went to her blade, and the weapon looked like it was made from frozen starlight, and she whispered that they were being followed. The attack came from everywhere at once, and creatures burst from the forest floor. And they were part shadow and part plant, and twisted together in ways that hurt to look at. And these were Vex, corrupted servants, and monsters. Made from flesh and forest combined, Kate fired her plasma rifle 3 times, and the nearest creatures vaporized. But 2 more took their place immediately, and she kept firing, and Lyra moved like lightning with her star blade cutting through the twisted things. Then the dragon roared, and the world became ice and fury, and his breath swept across the clearing in a wave of crystals, and everything it touched froze solid and shattered into pieces, and the corrupted creatures broke apart like glass sculptures. In the sudden quiet, a slow clapping sound came from the trees, and a figure stepped from the shadows, and he was tall and would have been handsome, except for the corruption crawling under his skin like living tattoos, and his eyes were completely black and reflected nothing. Lord Vex said, impressive. And the pet dragon still had some fire, or rather some frost in him, and his voice was smooth like poisoned honey, and he looked at Kate and said, so this was Kate Morrison, and hero of the Meridian blockade and savior of 1,000 worthless lives, and he asked if it comforted her knowing she had only delayed what could not be stopped. Lyra moved between Kate and Vex and demanded to know what he wanted. Vex smiled, and his teeth were slightly too sharp, and he said, want. And he wanted what he had always wanted, and to finish what they started before. Lyra cowardice interrupted everything, and he looked at Lyra with terrible intensity and said the archive was not a weapon to end wars, it was a weapon to end worlds. And Lyra was leading Kate directly to it. Kate mind raced, and she connected pieces that suddenly made horrible sense, and Lyra's reluctance, and her knowledge of Vex territory and the way they moved through the forest with similar grace. Vex said that was right, and they had been family once before. Lyra decided that mercy mattered more than survival, and she chose to protect humanity.
Ow.
Instead of letting nature take its course, and now look where they were, with the Confederation crumbling and chaos spreading everywhere, and only the archive could change the balance. Lyra had the archive was a doomsday weapon, and it did not choose between friend and enemy, and it unmade everything within range. Vex spread his hands wide and said precisely, and when the Confederation finally collapsed, and when the warlords tore each other apart, whoever controlled the way archive would control the future. And he looked at Kate and said the human understood this, and that was why she came, and not for peace but for power. Kate met his black eyes without looking away and said she came because without the archive her people would die, and they would go extinct or become slaves, and if having that weapon meant survival, then yes, she would do what was necessary. Vex's smile grew wider, and he said honest, and he appreciated that, and it almost made him reluctant to kill her, and he said, almost what happened next was too fast for Kate to fully process, and Lyra moved like lightning in her starblade cut patterns in the air that seemed to slice reality itself, and the dragon lunged forward with impossible speed, and his jaws snapped toward Vex's throat, but Vex was already gone, and he dispersed into shadow and reformed 20 feet away. Vex's voice came from multiple directions, and he said, "Not yet, sister, and soon, very soon." Lyra would have to choose between Kate's survival and the galaxy's safety, and he said the archive did not just destroy worlds, and it unmade the barriers between dimensions. And he told Kate that opening that vault would not just give her a weapon, and it would open a door that could never be closed again. His laughter faded into the forest, and only the sound of rain remained, and rain that hissed and steamed where it hit the corrupted ground. Kate turned to Lyra and asked if it was true about the dimensional barriers. The elf warrior was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the rain, and she said the archive had been created by the precursors and the civilization that came before everyone else, and they built it as a last defense against an invasion from somewhere else and somewhere outside normal reality, and it worked. But the survivors sealed it away because using it had consequences nobody fully understood. Kate said, "So you were going to let me open it anyway?" Lyra said she was going to let Kate choose, and with full knowledge of what it meant, and Vex was right about one thing, and without the archive, humanity would fall, but with it, they all might fall together. The dragon lowered his head beside Lyra and offered silent comfort, and Kate stood in the poisoned rain, and Hay's broken spear felt heavy at her belt, and she wondered if there had ever been a right choice or if they were doomed from the start. Kate said they would keep going, and they would reach the archive, and then they would figure out what came next. Lyra nodded slowly, and something like respect showed in her ancient eyes, and she said then they would keep going, but Kate needed to remember this moment and remember that Lyra had warned her, and some doors once opened could never be closed again. They walked deeper into Shadowfan, and toward the heart of darkness, and toward a choice that would decide everything, and behind them the forest whispered with Vex's laughter, and ahead something far older and far more terrible waited with endless patience. The path to salvation and damnation seemed to be exactly the same thing. On the 5th day, they saw strange lights moving between the trees, and Lyra said those were soul fires and the ghosts of everyone who had died trying to reach the archive, and they were trapped here forever and unable to move on. Kate asked if they were dangerous. Lyra said only to those who felt guilt, and the soul fires fed on regret and on the weight of choices that could not be unmade. Kate thought about Hayes and about the people back home and about every decision she had made that led to this moment, and she felt the weight of all of it pressing down on her, but she kept walking because that was all she could do. The forest grew darker, and the trees grew more twisted, and Kate saw things moving in the shadows that were not quite real and not quite alive, and Lyra said they were close now, and close to the archive, and close to the moment when everything would change. Dragon made a low warning sound, and frost formed in the air, and Lyra said something was wrong, and the forest itself was afraid, and when the forest was afraid, that meant something truly terrible was near. They came to a ridge and looked down into a valley, and in the center stood a structure made of stone that was impossibly old and covered in symbols that hurt Kate's eyes when she tried to look at them directly. Lyra said that was it, and that was the archive, and the weapon that could save or destroy everything. Kate stared at the ancient structure and felt something pull at her mind, and the symbols seemed to writhe and shift, even though she knew they were not moving, and she understood that just looking at the archive was dangerous. Lyra said they would camp here tonight and enter in the morning, and they needed to be rested and clear-minded because what came next would test them in ways that weapons and strength could not help with as night fell. Kate sat beside the dragon and felt its warmth cutting through the cold, and Lyra sat across from them and stared at the distant archive. Kate asked if Lyra regretted bringing her here. Lyra was quiet for a long time and finally said regret was too simple a word for what she felt, and she had run from this place for 40 years because she could not bear what it asked of her, and now she had brought someone else to face the same choice. Kate said at least it would be her choice to make. Lyra looked at her with eyes that held centuries of pain, and said yes, and that was all anyone could do and give. People the choice even when all the options were terrible. They sat in silence and watched the archive in the distance and thought about tomorrow and about the doors that would open and the ones that might never close again. The archive revealed itself on the seventh day, and it rose from the forest floor like a monument to gods that everyone had forgotten, and Kate had expected gleaming technology or crystal towers, but instead found stone that was impossibly ancient, and covered in symbols that made her head hurt when she looked at them, and the characters seemed to move and shift like they existed in more than 3 dimensions. Lyra stood before the entrance and studied the markings, and her hand shook slightly as she traced one of the symbols, and this was the only fear Kate had seen from her. And Lyra said the precursors did not believe in making things easy, and this door needed 3 keys and blood and will and sacrifice, and she said she had the first 2, but the third required something Kate was not ready to give. Before Kate could ask what that meant, the dragon suddenly reared back, and his crystal scales reflected colors that should not exist, and a low growl came from deep in his chest, and the temperature dropped so fast that Kate's breath turned to ice crystals in the air. They were not alone anymore. Figures came from the forest, and they moved like humans, but their proportions were wrong and stretched out like someone had pulled them too long, and their skin was see-through and showed geometries underneath that made Kate's eyes hurt, and when they spoke, their voices came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice said, "Intruders approach the seal, and this could not be permitted." Lyra stepped in front of Kate fast and said, "Guardians," and these were the precursors' final defense. And they were not alive in any normal way, and they were consequences given form and paradoxes that existed to prevent. What should not happen? Kate raised her rifle, even though she knew bullets would be useless here, and asked if opening the archive was one of those things. Lyra said opening it without understanding what you unleashed was definitely one of those things. The lead guardian tilted its head at an angle that would break a normal neck, and said the elf knew truth and the human sought power without wisdom, and this could not be permitted, and it told Kate to return to her ship and leave this world or become part of the soil that fetid. Kate's jaw clenched tight, and she said she had not come this far to be turned away by philosophical guardians, and her people were dying, and the Confederation was collapsing, and they needed this. The guardian interrupted, and its voice made ripples in the air that hurt Kate's teeth, and it said need was not justification, and the archive contained the Unmaker Protocol, and it did not save things, it erased them. And everything within range stopped existing, and was retroactively deleted from causality itself, and if Kate used it against her enemies, she would ensure their defeat, but also ensure that every choice they made and every life they saved and every moment of joy they created never happened. Kate felt something cold settle in her stomach, and said so it did not just kill them, it erased them from history. The guardian said, from history and from memory, and from the basic fabric of reality, and as if they never existed, and it moved closer, and Kate could see through it to something vast and terrible lurking just beyond what she could perceive, and it asked if Kate's survival was worth the complete obliteration of billions, and not just their deaths, but their existences. Lyra stepped forward with her star blade drawn but lowered and said they understood the cost, but asked the guardian to consider the alternative, and without the archive the human confederation would fall, and warlord factions would enslave or kill every peaceful species in 3 sectors, and the suffering would be beyond measure. The guardian said suffering was temporary, but erasure was eternal, and it shifted its attention to the dragon, who met its gaze without fear, and said even the dragon understood this, and he had lived long enough to know that some prices were too high even for survival. The dragon rumbled something in a language older than words, and the guardian seemed to listen, and then inclined its head slightly, and said the Ancient One spoke wisdom, and he said that choice must remain. Choice, even when all options were terrible, and forcing wisdom created only resentment, and never understanding the guardians began to fade away. But the lead one paused, still partly visible, and said the vault would open if they had the 3 keys and blood and will and sacrifice, but Kate needed to know that the sacrifice required was not one anyone could prepare for, and it was the surrender of certainty itself, and if Kate entered with absolute conviction the door would stay sealed. And if she entered with doubt and with understanding that she might be wrong, then it would open. And this was the precursor's final lesson. And only those who questioned their own righteousness should wield ultimate power. The guardians vanished completely, and left Kate and Lyra standing before the ancient door, and the forest seemed quieter now, like it was waiting for their decision. Kate said quietly that doubt was a key, and they built a weapon that could only be accessed by those who were not sure. They should use it, Lyra agreed, and said the precursors were paradoxical beings, and they believed certainty was the most dangerous force in the universe, and every genocide and every atrocity and every horror began with someone being absolutely sure they were right. And Lyra placed her palm against the stone and asked if Kate was ready to admit she might be making the wrong choice. Kate thought about Hayes and about his broken spear at her belt, and she thought about the millions back home, waiting for salvation that might cost everything they believed in. And she thought about Vec's words about opening doors that could never close. Kate said she was terrified that she was wrong, and terrified that this weapon would save them but destroy something more important, and terrified that there was no good choice here, and only different kinds of catastrophe. The door shuddered, and ancient mechanisms groaned to life. Lyra said softly, "That was the first key, and blood was hers, because she had been bleeding for this cause longer than humanity had been flying through space." And she drew her blade across her palm and let red drops fall on the stone, and the symbols blazed with light. Lyra continued and said Will was Kate, and she should place her hand on the door and state her intention while knowing it might be wrong. Kate pressed her palm against the cold stone and said she intended to claim the Unmaker protocol, and not because she was certain it was right, but because every alternative she could see was worse, and she was choosing between horrors, and she chose the one that might let her. People survived. The door began to open and revealed darkness beyond, but before they could enter, Vec's voice echoed across the clearing. Vec said how touching, and the human had learned to doubt herself, but he asked his sister if she told Kate about the third key, and if she explained what sacrifice meant in this context. Lyra's expression went rigid, and the dragon moved to stand beside her, and for the first time Kate saw something like sorrow in the ancient creature eyes. Vec's continued, and his corrupted form came together from shadow, and he said, "The sacrifice was not what you gave up, but what you became. And the archive did not just give you a weapon, it bonded with you, and linked to your mind and your soul and your very existence. And once it's bonded, you became its keeper forever, and immortal and unchanging and unable to die until the archive itself was destroyed." And Lyra knew this. And that was why she ran from it 40 years ago, and why she spent decades in exile, because she could not bear to become what the archive required. Kate turned to Lyra and searched her face, and the elf warrior met her gaze steadily and said it was true, and the archive needed a consciousness to operate, and someone to make the final decision of when, how to use it, and once you bonded with it, you became its living key, and you would live for thousands of years, watching everyone you loved age and die while carrying the weight of the most terrible weapon ever created. Kate said, "So, you knew this, Lyra?" Voice was heavy with regret, and she said she knew, and she brought Kate here anyway, because the choice had to be made, and it had to be Kate's choice, and Lyra could not make that choice 40 years ago, because she was too afraid of what she would become. But Kate was stronger, or perhaps just more desperate. Kate looked into the darkness beyond the door, and then back at the forest, where her ship waited, and where a future without the archive meant watching her people fall. And she thought about Hayes, who died because she sent him ahead, and she thought about the billions who would die if she turned back. No, she thought about immortality, and about watching generations rise and fall, while she remained unchanged and guardian of a weapon that could erase civilizations. Kate said there had to be another way, but even she heard the lack of conviction in her voice. Vex said there was not, and that was the beautiful cruelty of it. And Kate could save her people, but lose herself in the process, or preserve her humanity and watch her species die. And he told her to choose quickly, because his forces surrounded this location. And in moments none of this would matter anyway, as if his words summoned them. The forest erupted with movement, and corrupted servants emerged from every shadow with weapons ready, and Kate rifle would be useless against so many and even the dragon. Mighty Breath would be overwhelmed by their numbers. The only way forward was through the door and into the darkness, and toward a fate that might be worse than death. Itself, Kate took a step toward the vault, and then another, and behind her she heard Lyra whisper that she was sorry, but whether the elf apologized for bringing her here, or for what came next, Kate would never know. A voice came from everywhere and nowhere, and it was ancient beyond human comprehension, and it said approach, and Kate had passed the trials and blood given freely, and will tempered by doubt. And now came the sacrifice, and the binding of consciousness. To purpose and of mortal soul to eternal duty, Kate forced herself to move forward, and each step felt like walking through quicksand made of frozen time, and she asked what happened after, and after she bonded with the archive, the voice said she would become the keeper and guardian and operator in conscience, and the protocol responded only to its keeper will, and this ensured that such terrible power could not be wielded carelessly, and Kate would age 1 year for every century that passed, and her wounds would heal within moments, and her mind would retain perfect clarity across thousands of years, and she would watch civilizations rise and fall, and watch loved ones become dust, and watch the stars themselves grow cold, all while bearing the knowledge that she held the power to erase any of it from existence. Kate hand trembled as she reached toward the crystal and asked what if she refused. The voice said then the door would seal and her world would fall, and the cycle of suffering would continue, and eventually another desperate soul would stand where Kate stood now and faced the same choice outside. She could hear the sounds of battle and the dragon roaring and Lyra shouting and plasma fire and the screams of dying servants. And how long until Vex broke through, and how long until the vault became a tomb? The archive voice held something almost like compassion, and it said Kate Morrison, and this choice defined her not as a warrior or a leader, but as a moral agent. And the precursors created the archive because they understood that some evils were so vast that opposing them required accepting a different, more personal evil, and they made it terrible. Not to discourage use, but to ensure that only the truly desperate would seek it, and Kate was desperate, and her people needed her, and the question was whether she was willing to pay the price of being there. Salvation. Kate thought of her crew on the ship waiting for her return, and she thought of the colonies on the Confederation edge defenseless against warlord fleets, and she thought of children who would grow up as slaves if she failed here. She thought of immortality spent in isolation, carrying a burden no one else could share. Her hand touched the crystal pain, exploded through every nerve, but it was not physical pain, it was existential. As if her very soul was being rewritten at the fundamental level, and information flooded her consciousness, and the schematics of the protocol, and the mathematics of causality, manipulation, and the philosophical frameworks required to target erasure without accidentally unmaking reality itself. And she saw the faces of every precursor who had contemplated creating this weapon, and saw their anguish and determination, and saw the price they paid for protecting their galaxy, and she understood they had all been keepers once, and every precursor who survived the invasion had bonded with the protocol in sequence in passing the burden down through their civilization, until the last of them had sealed it away, unable to bear the responsibility any longer. Now it was humanity's turn, and Kate turned the binding completed, and Kate stood transformed, and she felt the weight of centuries she had not yet lived in the clarity of a mind that would never forget, and the isolation of being unable to share what she now knew. But she also felt power, and vast and terrible and precise power, and the protocol responded to her thoughts. Like an extension of her will, she could erase Vex from existence, and could delete the warlord fleets targeting the Confederation, and could reshape causality itself to ensure humanity's survival. But the archive whispered a warning, and every use came with consequences that rippled across reality. And erase Vex, and every life he saved, however accidentally, would also be unmade, and delete the warlords and the power. Vacuum would invite something worse, and reality was interconnected and woven together in ways that made surgical intervention impossible. Kate opened her eyes, and they held depths they had not before. and she walked back through the door in the battle. Outside had reached its peak, and Lyra was wounded, and her star blade cracked and fighting back-to-back with the dragon. Against an overwhelming tide of corrupted servants, and Vex stood at the edge of the clearing, protected by a barrier of shadow, watching his sister last stand with satisfaction. Lyra gasped when Kate emerged and said, "Run and get to the ship." Kate voice carried harmonics it had not before, and echoing with the weight of the archive, and she said no, and no more running. She raised her hand, and reality bent, and the corrupted servants froze mid-attack, held in suspended animation, as Kate rewrote the local causality field, and she did not erase them. Because she was not that desperate yet, and not ready to pay that price, and instead she simply commanded them to cease, and the protocol enforced her will on the fabric of existence itself. Vex's barrier shattered, and he staggered back, and black eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear, and he said, Kate bonded with it, and actually bonded with it, and asked if she had any idea what she had done. Kate said quietly that she knew exactly what she had done, and she accepted responsibility for a power she never wanted and could never give up, and she traded her humanity for her people's survival, and she became exactly what the precursors feared and needed in equal measure. Walked toward Vex, and each step caused frost to spread across the ground, and this was a side effect of the massive energy required to maintain the SD protocol active state. And she said, Vex wanted this weapon to reshape the galaxy according to his vision, but that was not what it was for, and the precursors did not create the Unmaker to conquer, but to protect. Vex laughed bitterly and said protect, and asked if Kate thought she was protecting anyone, and said she was just another tyrant with ultimate power, pretending moral superiority justified her existence, it admitted. Perhaps that was all any keeper could be, but at least she understood the horror of what she had become, and at least she would spend eternity questioning whether she made the right choice, and she asked if Vex could say the same. She extended her will toward Vex, but not to erase him, and instead to contain him, and the protocol wrapped him in a causality prison and a bubble of frozen time that would hold him until Kate decided otherwise, and she said he was going to live, and not because he deserved mercy, but because erasure was too easy and too clean, and he would have time to contemplate what he had become, just as she would. Lyra approached, slowly leaning on the dragon for support, and blood stained her armor, and her ancient eyes were filled with sorrow, and she said she was sorry, and she brought Kate here, and now Kate was changed forever. Kate interrupted gently and said it was what she chose to be, and Lyra gave her the choice, and that was all anyone could do. And Kate looked down at her hands, which now glowed faintly with the protocol power, and said the Guardians were right, and doubt was the key, because certainty was dangerous, and she would spend forever uncertain and questioning every decision and wondering if there was another way, and maybe that was exactly what a keeper should. Beatty dragon rumbled something, and Lyra translated and said, he said Kate had the strength to bear this burden, and that her doubt would keep her honest where certainty would have corrupted her. Kate smiled sadly and said she hoped he was right, because if he was wrong, and she did not finish the sentence because they all knew what was at stake. The corrupted servants began to retreat, and their connection to Vex severed by the causality prison, and the forest slowly returned to its eerie silence. And in the distance, Kate's ship waited, and her crew, unaware that their captain had just become something more and less than human. Lyra asked quietly, what now? Kate looked up at the sky and at the stars where her people fought and died, and where the Confederation last stand played out across many worlds, and she said now she did what she must, and she would return to the fleet and deploy the protocol only when absolutely necessary, and try to ensure that the cure was not worse than the disease. And she paused and said she accepted that she would be making these choices for thousands of years to come, and always wondering if she was the guardian humanity needed, or the tyrant they would eventually fear. She turned to Lyra, and in her transformed eyes the elf saw both the frightened captain who had arrived days ago and the eternal guardian she had become. And Kate asked if Lyra would help her, and she would need someone who understood the weight of centuries, and someone who could tell her when she was going to Lyra glanced at the dragon, who rumbled his agreement, and Lyra said they had been running from responsibility for 40 years, and perhaps it was time they stopped, and yes, she would stand with Kate for however long this burden must be borne. Kate nodded, accepting this new and terrible companionship, and together they walked back through the dying forest toward the ship, and toward a galaxy that did not know it had just gained a protector who would outlive civilizations behind them. Vex remained frozen in his causality, prison-aware but unable to act, in a monument to the dangers of certainty without wisdom, and deep within Kate consciousness, the Unmaker protocol whispered its deadly knowledge, patient and waiting, and terrible and necessary, and a weapon that would ensure humanity's survival, at a cost that would take thousands of years to fully understand. The war ended within 3 months of Kate's return, and she did not need to deploy the protocol directly, because the mere knowledge of its existence and the demonstration of her power during the Battle of Crimson Nebula was enough, and the warlord factions surrendered or fled to the outer reaches, and the Confederation stabilized and reformed and began to heal. Kate stood on the observation deck of the newly named ship Guardian Watch and watched the celebrations across many worlds through the view screens. And humanity had survived, and her people would continue, and the price had been paid and the cosmic debt settled, except it had not, and not really. Lyra joined her at the window, and the dragon crystalline form was visible through the reinforced glass because he was too large for the ship interior, but always nearby, circling their vessel like a protective constellation. And Lyra said. Kate looked troubled. Kate said quietly that she looked the same as she did 3 months ago, and had not aged a day and would not age a day for the next century, and everyone else was celebrating and moving forward with their lives, and she was frozen and already becoming separate from them. It was true, and she had noticed the changes, and the way her crew looked at her with a mixture of respect and unease, and how conversations stopped when she entered a room, and how even her oldest friends struggled to meet her eyes, now that they held centuries she had not yet lived. Lyra said humanity called Kate a hero, and they had built monuments and written songs and declared a holiday in her honor. But Kate did not feel like a hero. Kate said she felt like a weapon pretending to be a person, and the protocol was always there in her mind, showing her how she could solve every problem in pirates, raiding the outer colonies and erase them, and political corruption threatening the Confederation and erase the corrupt officials, and natural disasters and disease outbreaks and economic crises. And she had the power to fix all of it by simply deleting problems from reality. I observed that Kate did not do those things. Kate agreed and said she did not, because that was not what the protocol was for, and the precursors made it clear. It was a last resort and a final option when extinction itself was at stake, and use it casually, and she would become exactly what Vex accused her of being, and a tyrant with ultimate power, rewriting reality according to her limited understanding. Turned away from the window, facing Lyra directly, and asked how Lyra had borne it, and all those centuries, knowing she could intervene and could fix things, but choosing not to. Lyra said softly that she did not bear it, and she ran from it and hid in exile, and let the galaxy burn, because she was too afraid of what she might become if she acted. And Kate was already stronger than Lyra had been, because Kate accepted the burden Lyra could not carry. Kate said she did not feel strong, and she felt terrified. The dragon voice rumbled through the hull and translated by the bond shared with Lyra, and Kate had learned to understand him over the past months as she learned to understand many things her mortal self never could have grasped. And he said terror kept them honest, and certainty made them monsters. An alert chimed softly, and Admiral Collins appeared on the screen, and he was one of the few people who still treated Kate like a person rather than a living weapon. And he said they had a situation, and the mining colony on Terrace 7 was under attack, and unidentified hostiles and possibly remnants of the warlord fleets, and they were requesting immediate assistance. Kate felt the protocol stir, showing her solutions, and she could erase the attackers and ensure they never existed, or she could rewrite causality so the attack never happened, or she could simply command the hostiles to stop and enforcing her on reality itself. But she did none of these things. She ordered dispatch the Third Fleet in standard rescue protocols, and she would be monitoring. But this was a job for conventional forces. Collins nodded with approval, and he understood what she was doing and refusing to become the easy answer and refusing to let humanity grow dependent on a power that should not exist. And he said understood. And Third Fleet, launching now as the channel closed. Kate felt the protocol disappointment, if such a thing could be said, to have emotions, and it wanted to be used and to fulfill its purpose and to demonstrate its terrible efficiency, but Kate kept it leashed and kept it hungry and kept it waiting for a crisis truly worthy of its deployment. Avru observed that Kate was going to spend the next 1,000 years saying no and watching people die who she could save and watching suffering she could end, and always choosing the harder path because the easy one led to damnation. Said simply yes, and that was exactly what she was going to do. Lyra asked, what would happen when the next true crisis came, and when another Vex rose, and when another threat to existence emerged? Kate's expression hardened. And she said then she would use it, and she would bear the cost, and she would spend the next 1,000 years wondering if she was right, and that was what it meant to be a keeper, an eternal duty, an eternal doubt, an eternal vigilance. She returned to the window, watching as the Third Fleet departed for Terrath 7 in conventional forces, in conventional solutions, in the slow and uncertain path of normal existence, and it would take them hours to reach the colony, and people might die who she could save instantly, but instant salvation came at a price that corrupted everything it touched. Kate said quietly that the precursors knew, and when they created the protocol, they knew that its greatest danger was not misuse. It was too easy use, and they made the price deliberately terrible so that only the desperate would seek it, and they ensured that price was paid eternally so that complacency could never take root. Lyra agreed. It said a weapon that punished its wielder, and perhaps the only kind of ultimate power that could be trusted. The days became weeks, and weeks became months, and Kate remained at her post in the Eternal Guardian, saying no 1,000 times for every time she said yes, and the protocol grew dusty in her mind, and its vast power held in reserve, waiting for the moment when humanity truly needed it. That moment came. In the 43rd year of her keeping, UA Rift opened at the edge of known space, and not a natural anomaly but a deliberate breach, and something forcing its way through from outside. Reality, and the same threat that had driven the precursors to create the protocol in the first place, had finally found humanity. Galaxy Kate felt it before the sensors detected it, and the protocol waking fully for the first time in decades, recognizing its purpose and its reason for existence, and the things coming through the rift were called by many names in the precursors' records, and devourers and reality eaters and the unknowable. They were vast and incomprehensible and existing partially outside normal space-time, and they were hungry. Lyra burst onto the bridge where Kate stood in silent communion with the protocol and said the outer colonies were reporting impossible readings, and something was happening. Kate said she knew, and they were here, and what the precursors faced and what they created the protocol to stop. She felt the weight of her choices collapse into this single moment, and every time she had said no, in every life she chose not to save, in every easy solution she refused, and all of it had led here to a threat that justified the protocol existence. Collins asked if they could fight them, though they all knew the answer. Kate said conventional forces would be less than insects to them, and the protocol was designed for exactly this. And not for politics, and not for conquest, and not for the petty conflicts of mortal species, but for this. She closed her eyes. Reaching deep into the bond with the archive, and the Unmaker stirred fully to life in its vast consciousness merging with hers, showing her the price of what came next, and to erase the devourers she would need to delete not just them, but the breach itself. And to do that would require unmaking the last 5 years of causality in a sphere, encompassing 3 star systems, everything that had happened there, and births and deaths and triumphs and tragedies would cease to have ever occurred, and the people there would not die. They would retroactively never have existed, and including Kate's own sister, who had moved to one of those systems for years ago. Kate whispered there had to be another way, but the protocol showed her the truth with pitiless clarity, and there was not in either erase the infected space-time or watch the Devourers consume the entire galaxy and reality itself unraveling. In their wake, Lyra hand found Kate's shoulder and said softly that the choice to find them and not the power, but what they were willing to sacrifice to use it. Correctly, Kate thought of her sister and of the millions in those three systems, and of their entire existences about to be deleted from the timeline, and she thought of the billions beyond who would live if she acted, and die if she did not. She thought of why the precursors had made this weapon so terrible, and so that using it would never be easy, and never be comfortable, and never be anything but a last resort paid for in anguish. Kate whispered that she was sorry, and sorry to his sister, who would never know she had existed, and who would be unmade before she had ever been born. She opened herself fully to the protocol, and let its vast power flow through her, and spoke the words that would reshape reality. She said, "Target Devourers and associated causality corruption in Scope 3 systems and 5-year temporal range, and Authorization Keeper Prime, and execute Unmaker Protocol." The universe screamed reality, rewrote itself in causality, collapsing and reforming in a cascade that Kate would remember with